Hello, I'm Sandra Earley. I'm an assistant professor of online journalism in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications here at Savannah State. With me today is Karen Abbott, a writer who's in town for the Savannah Book Festival, and we're going to talk about bringing the past to life through writing. Miss Abbott really knows how to tell a story and how to sell a story, and she's not even making them up. She writes history, nonfiction, and her books are anything but the dry and heavy stereotype applied to books of history. Your books are cultural history, is that fair? With sizzle.
Yes.
Okay. Just listen to the titles of her 3 books so you'll know why the word sizzle applies. And remember, these stories are true. They're not fiction. Sin in the Second City, Madams, Ministers, Playboys, and the Battle for America's Soul. American Rose, A Nation Laid Bare, The Life and Times of Gypsy Rose Lee. Bears a pun. Who's Gypsy Rose Lee?
Gypsy Rose Lee was perhaps the most famous ecdysiast, in the words of H.L. Mencken, more commonly known as a stripper or burlesque performer in the 1920s and 30s. But she was also much more than that. She was a writer for The New Yorker. She was a playwright. She was a novelist. She was a member of the New York intelligentsia and literati, and pretty much her life was a microcosm of 20th century America, and I wanted to, with that book, view America through the lens of this very dynamic and fascinating woman's life.
The third one, the newest one, out last September,
yes,
is Liar, Temptress, Soldier, Spy, 4 Women Undercover in the Civil War. That's 2 spies for the North and 2 spies for the South,
right.
All colorful and brave. I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later. A little biography. Ms. Abbott began her writing career as a magazine journalist in her native Philadelphia. These days she lives in New York, writes frequently for the online editions of the New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, and then the online magazine Slate. Her blog is called Wicked History. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Sandra.
Okay. So we're talking about bringing the past to life through writing. A good idea can put you halfway to a good essay, story, or book. So where do your ideas come from?
Well, most of mine actually come from my grandmother, who is now 96 years old. Actually, I had never been really interested in history. I was a journalist writing about current events and current topics. But my grandmother told me a story about her mother and her mother's sister, who came over from Slovenia in 1905 to the United States. And one weekend, the sister went to Chicago and was never heard from again. So I was always intrigued and haunted by this bit of family lore and wondering what happened to this missing ancestor. And I began looking into Chicago in 1905. And came upon a story about Marshall Field Jr., the son of the department store magnate, and he was shot. And the rumor was that he was shot in a brothel, a world-famous brothel called the Earley Club. So, as terrible as it sounds, I immediately forgot all about my missing ancestor and was much more intrigued by these 2 madams, these sort of enigmatic, mysterious sisters from Virginia, who sort of reinvented themselves and became the most famous madams of the most lavish brothel in history. And from then on, I wanted to write about history pretty much exclusively.
This is curiosity, isn't it? And it is everything that journalism starts out to be, but you're carrying it into talking about history. That's wonderful. Okay, so your books are cultural history, sometimes called sizzle history. Is that fair?
I do, and you know, I always am surprised that somebody, because a couple times people have asked me, oh, do you think a man would be called a sizzle historian? And maybe not, but I will say that a woman journalist is the one who came up with it, and a woman journalist I respect, and I thought, I didn't take it in a sort of salacious or sexual connotation. I thought about it more in trying to make history exciting for people who might not normally find history interesting. So to me, sizzle is sort of taking the forgotten bits of history and forgotten characters of history who are maybe a little bit living on the edges, a little bit subversive, a little bit daring and risky. And so to me, that's what sizzle connotes.
And you find yourself writing a lot about women.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as we all know, history is usually written by, about, and for men. The women's stories are often forgotten or put to the wayside, or really not given the attention they're due. And to me, it's a great fun and an honor to try to resurrect these women and make their exploits and their personalities and their lives known to a whole new generation of people.
Absolutely. Okay, now we get into the part where you give advice about how to write and how to do it. So we're talking about bringing the past to life in a book. How do you do that? What's the secret?
I think the most important factor in terms of writing, what you would call maybe a dry academic history versus a narrative history is the details. Details are what make a scene or a character come to life. So in order to do details, you have to do the research. And research is my favorite part of the process. It's kind of like a detective search. You never know. And I don't like doing online research. Everything already there is really curated for you. Somebody's already gone through it and picked what they wanted to put online and arranged it for you. And it's not quite the same as going to the archives yourself and physically touching the box and saying, I don't know what's going to be in the next box or the next folder, and it's a surprise. And there's always an element of surprise in there, and maybe something you weren't expecting to find, and something that makes an emotional connection for you to the material. I remember for my book about female Civil War spies, Liar, Tempter, Soldier, Spy, I found one of the death threats that the spy received. And I thought, I was chilled reading that death threat in, current day, and I can't imagine what she felt reading this and holding this in her hands back in 1864. So it's the kind of thing that you're not going to experience if you do research solely online.
Boy, is that the truth.
Yeah.
And that the details are incredibly important, and doing original research with the original documents is the way to go, it seems to me. Which actually leads us to a good question. You started in journalism. What impact did that have on all of this?
I think journalism actually trains you to find what details are going to make a story work. Because especially in journalism, when you have a word count limit, you have 800 words. How are you going to get to the crux of this? How are you going to make this character pop in a sentence or two? And I think journalism gives you that sort of eye for the exact right detail. And you can't try to be funny. You can't try to be poignant. You can't try to be smart. You have to let the details be funny and poignant and smart for you. So I think journalism really teaches you how to distill the information you get into a compact story and to cut, you learn that your words aren't precious. You learn that you can cut them and you'll live.
That's exactly right. Which leads us to a favorite detail. You have Belle Boyd, who is a very flamboyant Southern belle in the latest book. Do you have a favorite detail about her?
I do. Belle Boyd was very overt for her time period. She was sort of very overt about her opinions and her sexuality in a way that was very uncommon for a girl of that time period. And she would say outrageous things about generals and the generals she was trying to seduce. And she was particularly obsessed with Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. Oh, yeah. And she would tell, this was one of my favorite quotes, she would tell people, she told a Northern reporter that she wanted to, quote, occupy Stonewall's tent and share his dangers. Which if I were Stonewall Jackson, I always say would have frightened me more than anything the Union Army had in store for me, because she was quite a character and hot-headed and flew off the handle easily. I mean, she opens the book by shooting a Union soldier and getting away with it.
That's my favorite detail.
Yeah. Well, that one too.
He's in her front hall, and she plugs him between the eyes or something.
Yeah.
Or was it in the chest? I can't remember.
I don't even know if it was actually specified where she shot him, but it was a fatal shot, and
she got away with it.
She got away with it.
Which is an interesting question to me, too. These women were, for the most part, upper class women, and seemed to me protected in their spying by their rank in society and by their wealth.
Right.
Is that accurate?
I'd say that's definitely fair. And also just the society's expectations of what women were and weren't capable of. And these women brilliantly exploited the idea of the weaker sex. and use their gender as both a physical and psychological disguise. Physically, they're hiding dispatches and secrets up in their hair or in their corsets or in their stockings. And psychologically, if anybody accuses them of treasonous activity, the customary response was, "How dare you? I am a defenseless woman." And it was, the men usually exactly. Exactly, and it worked.
It did indeed. Talk a little bit about Elizabeth Van Loo, who was a rich matron. Actually, matron maybe doesn't apply because she was never married.
Right.
But in Richmond, she was very liberal, spied for the North, had servants in her household, not slaves, sent some of her servants north to be educated, and she used one of those, Mary Elizabeth Bowser, to spy.
She was a remarkable woman, Elizabeth Van Loo, and I really believe that without her and her spy ring and the servants that she employed, the North would not have won the war. And she had quite an interesting background. She was born and raised in Richmond, but sent north to Philadelphia to be educated, and was under the care of an abolitionist governess, and came back to Richmond and was appalled by slavery and appalled by the conditions of the slaves in Richmond, and freed all of her family's slaves. And as you said, a lot of them stayed on to work with the family for a wage. And she took a special shine to one former slave, Mary Bowser, and decides to place her as a spy in the Confederate White House. Verena Davis, the first lady of the Confederacy, put out a call and said, "I'm staffing the White House, I need help." And Elizabeth pays her a visit and says, "I have a girl for you. She's not very bright. And she stumbles in the kitchen, but she'll serve your family well." And so little does anybody know that Mary Bowser is not only literate, but highly educated and gifted with a photographic memory, a really brilliant woman.
That, yeah.
And so while she's dusting Jefferson Davis's desk and picking up the children's toys, she's also sneaking peeks at his confidential papers and eavesdropping on conversations and reporting all of this back to Elizabeth, at great risk to her own life.
Absolutely, as Elizabeth Van Loo's life was at risk also.
Sure.
I'm curious about, here we are at a historically black university, and so I was really curious about why you didn't spend more time with people like Mary Elizabeth Bowser. And I believe Belle Boyd also used her slave to help her, who helped apparently willingly with her spying for the South. Was there not enough historical record? What was that?
That's exactly it. Mary Bowser reportedly left a diary that also reportedly one of her descendants threw out accidentally in the 1940s or 1950s, and I can't even, it's like, exactly, your heart just breaks. I mean, just imagine what Mary Jane Bowser wrote in her book. And unfortunately, I used every bit of information I could about her that I had, and I actually tracked down one of Elizabeth Van Loo's descendants, her brother's descendant, because she never had children. He filled in a little bit about Mary, and I tried to get as much in there as I could, but unfortunately that's all I had, and I had to just go by what the historical record said. But I really did want to get the point across that these African Americans, just as much as anybody else, risked their lives to help the North win.
Absolutely. Okay, we've established the kinds of books you read and all that sort of stuff. What's a typical writing day for you like? Or, for that matter, is a typical writing day a research day?
It depends. I'm somebody who has to, and I know a lot of people do this differently, I have to research and write at the same time, or else I would allow myself to fall down the rabbit hole of research and never emerge. I would just stay in the research phase and then end up having about 2 months to write, which isn't a good idea. So I try to research and write at the same time, and I think this is another journalism tactic that helped me. I would, if I didn't know something or if I needed to flesh it out, I knew it was thin, I would write it TKs everywhere, TK, and then I would go back.
To come.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, a research and writing day would probably, simultaneously, I would do them both. And I have 2 birds who wake me up every morning. Literally, they're in my bedroom. I live in New York City in a tiny apartment, and they're like right there. And they wake me up, and then I try to get as much done as I can. If I can get down 1,000 words in a day, that's a really good day.
So you write in the morning, write in the afternoon?
After I try to write in the morning, as close to the morning as I can get. I'm a night owl, and a bit of an insomniac. So my morning writing might start at 11:30. So.
I think the point about writing in sections and writing as you do research is very important. I think that students find it really daunting to approach a story that's even 1,000 words, 3,000 words long. And we have with us a student today who's going to ask some questions later, Sierra Walton. And you're nodding your head. You know what we're talking about here. So I think that's a really important way to approach dealing with a lot of information. Okay, now it's the advice time. What's the best writing advice you ever got, and what do you want to add to that?
I remember one of my first, not editors, a fellow reporter who was older and had a lot of experience, always said, write about what terrifies you and what thrills you. So I always thought that was really smart advice. And once I moved to Atlanta and I found some fellow writers in a writing group, their advice was, and I always thought this was good too, find people who are better than you, and surround yourself with people who are better than you, and don't be slotty. Slotty thinking is, comparing your career trajectory to somebody else's. There's room enough for everybody. There's room enough for all kinds of stories. And somebody's success isn't going to negate your own success or diminish your own chances. So that's the kind of thing that once you're actually in publishing and you have to constantly remind yourself. Comparison is the thief of joy, as they say.
That's David Halberstam, a great reporter for the New York Times, Vietnam War correspondent and later writer of books, used to tell people to find a writer that they liked and take a story written by that article and that person and take it apart and see how it works and use the ideas that they use for structure and that sort of thing. He also recommended reading crime fiction because crime fiction writers know how to tell really good stories.
That's true.
So I think that's
great advice.
Advice to live by. Back to particularly students and their work. We live in a really copy-paste online world. One thing that doing original research from the books and the papers themselves prevents is copy-paste.
Right.
But nonetheless, it's a reality, and plagiarism, I think, plagues students perhaps more than at any other time.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of primary and secondary sources. Oh my goodness, the lists at the end of the essays and at the end of the books are extensive. So how do you keep from inadvertent plagiarism?
Inadvertent is the key. I think it's especially when you're writing something like a blog piece and it's just a certain amount of words and you're trying to get it out there quickly. It's easy to and you're taking notes, and the notes you're taking are from the book and you have to just remember that not to take it verbatim. And in terms of book work, what I try to do is keep an outline, a physical outline. I'm sort of a technological Luddite. I like and I'm tactile. I like to hold the notes. And if I'll write down a piece of information or fact that I think is pertinent, and there's a corresponding sticky note in the book, and on the actual Word document, I'll say where I got it from. So the source is there, and I can always go back and refer to it and make sure that I'm not copying it word for word, that I'm getting the gist of the information across, but in my own way. So that's what I try to do. You're
working with a lot of old materials, and those are usually in restricted areas of the library. So you take your stuff in and
I'll either write from that or sometimes photocopy it and
And they let you put sticky notes on these?
Oh no. Sticky notes on my photocopies.
Okay. Okay. Good.
Yeah. No sticky notes in the archives.
Yeah, defacing a book is shocking.
Yeah.
All right. I think this is the same question. You've gotten some criticism, or the same sort of question. You've gotten some criticism from some people who have written about you, reviewed your books, about using source material that was debunked at the time. Particularly it was the soldier, the woman who went undercover as a soldier.
Yeah. Actually, that was the bothersome aspect of that review was that she picked one pet academic, I don't know if it was somebody she knew, who claims that this story was debunked. There were other subsequent books about that same soldier that debunked the debunking and that said, well, wait a minute, there's a little bit more ambiguity here. And I'm sure if she bothered to look at my sources more
Yeah.
carefully, she would have seen that I talked about that in my endnotes, and also that I
You
used
did,
primary
yeah.
source material that supported the idea that there is evidence here to support this soldier's a lot of what she says in her memoir. And if there is ambiguity in her memoir, I actually put it out in the narrative. I said, this is a lie, this is a lie, this is an embellishment, but here is some a story she tells that there's actually some basis in the historical record for, and I think it's fair to put it in there and then just talk a little bit about the source material in there. And I think it was a lazy review, frankly, and everybody gets them. So
Absolutely, and I think that there's an important message here too for students. When you've got a problem in a story or in a book, the easiest way to deal with it is to put the problem in the text and address it. Don't run away from it. Don't be scared of it.
Right.
Say what you know about it and move on, in essence. Is there a temptation, though, to make up and sweeten? Because you got great stories, but it could be a little better if Belle Boyd plugged the Yankee soldier between the eyes as opposed to in the chest.
Oh, I
or
would
whatever.
never make up a detail like that if I didn't know
It's
that.
too easy to check, isn't it?
Well, that and the fact that she killed the soldier and got away with it is dramatic enough. I don't need to embellish where it happened or, what part. I don't need to say what part of the body happened if I don't know. A lot of people say, well, if you go into their heads, how do you do that? How do you articulate their thought process? And I only do that when, somebody's writing in their diary. They're talking about their thought process. They're talking about their thoughts and what they were thinking and feeling at the time. And so, then I feel free to use that. And if they do something that's sort of the opposite of what they said, I feel free to say, she was sort of being tricky here. So people leave breadcrumbs of what they're thinking.
They do, yes.
And I think it's fair to assemble those and put those together and to sort of round out the character and make them an actual living, breathing human being again.
I think one of the things that the soldier, the woman who dressed as a male and then got shot and hurt and several times, and there was a discussion of sort of what she was feeling when her injury was in her leg and how that hampered her as she was riding and all that sort of stuff. Did she write about that, or
She did.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, she talked about hemorrhaging from the lungs. That was one of the phrases she used about when she got kicked in the gut. The foot thing, she couldn't wear shoes for the rest of her life. She had problems wearing shoes for the rest of her life, and she had written about that, and the fact that she had suffered a permanent deformity. So, and a lot of the times too, you can look up what their ailment was. If somebody was suffering from malaria,
what are the symptoms?
What are the symptoms of malaria? So it's sort of like, even if she doesn't say I was shaking and chills, although she did, I can pretty much, I think it's fair to look up the symptoms of malaria and say she was suffering from malaria, this is what she was feeling.
And that's one more of the points about doing a lot of research, knowing everything you can. Look up malaria and see what the symptoms are and how it works, so that you can get it right in the book. Now let me introduce to you, we've already done this before, but Sierra Walton, who is a junior here at SSU and majoring in journalism and mass communications, though if I remember correctly, it's the public relations track. Yes, okay. As part of your internship, part-time job, you did some research on Ms. Abbott, and she prefers to be called Abbott, right?
Yes.
Okay. And
no Ms. necessary.
Okay. Then wrote some questions, and some of the questions were really good.
Thank you.
Would you have at it?
Yes, especially being a college student here at Savannah State, students often have a difficult time writing in general. Can you give us some suggestions about where to find inspiration in order to make the process easier for ourselves?
When you say you have trouble writing, is it just because there's too much distraction around, or just what would you say the issue is?
More so having to write on a certain topic or a prompt versus creative writing, I guess.
So just having to write about something you're not really interested in. I mean, that's part of the being a student, I guess. And the thing I would best say, I had to do a couple of things like that in a professional job. I would get an assignment about a banker. I don't care about banking, but what I always try to do is find what's personal about it. If it's a subject or a person you're not really interested in, there's got to be one thing in there that intrigues you. There's got to be one little segment of that person's personality or background or their job, what they do, that you find a little weird or interesting or intriguing in some way. So I feel like that's your window in. And if you start there, then you can grow from there. So, and maybe, get your tentacles in the whole story.
What if you're writing about something like the prime rate?
I can't help you there.
Don't write about the prime rate.
Yeah, exactly. Don't write about the prime rate.
Yeah.
Next assignment.
That was an assignment I had once, and
oh God,
it was hard.
I would maybe write about why the prime rate is boring.
I'm not sure you're allowed to do that in some situations. How about another question, Sandra?
Right. In what ways can students make their writing distinct and creative in their own way?
Well, that's something that, not only students, I think everybody struggles with. How do you find your voice? And I read something somewhere where it says, you don't try to find your voice. And don't try to mimic somebody's voice. Although I think a good way to maybe start learning about voices, studying people's voices and what's unique about them. But at some point, it just starts coming naturally. And I feel like it's like riding a bike. At some point, you get on and it just starts happening for you. And it's basically practice. And it's sort of the best thing I can say is read, write. I know a lot of people who are like, I want to be a writer. And I was like, well, what do you like to read? Oh, I don't really read. Really? If you think you're going to be a writer, it's not going to happen. So it's like reading is part of the job. And I feel like once you see how voice works on the page, it just starts clicking for you in a personal way.
Okay.
Another suggestion: listen to books. Listen to audio books, but only by people who are good writers, people you admire.
Okay.
Even if it's crime fiction, if the person tells a good story, you get their words and their sounds in your head, and from that, if you practice, you can develop a voice that is distinct and unique. Okay. We're coming to the end of our time, and there's an old reporter's question that you always apply. It's the one that, in essence, covers your backside, and that is there anything about writing, about the kind of writing you do, nonfiction writing, or anything that we've talked about in this session that just needs saying, or that you want to elaborate on? Or do you want to tell us why you're called Abbott instead of Ms. Abbott, or whatever it is?
I think we were pretty thorough here. I'll tell you a story about this is something that would only happen in the internet age. One day a reader wrote to me and said, do you know if you Google yourself, it says that you died in 2010? And
Yikes.
It's like, this is why I never Google myself. And sure enough, I Google myself, like this. And it said I died in 2010. And also that there's a romance writer named Karen Abbott whose books are sometimes listed alongside mine. And I've had people say, oh, in your spare time in between your nonfiction books, are you writing Till Death Do Us Part? I was like, no, I've never written a book called Till Death, So I wanted to start trying to distinguish myself from her, and if when I do continue to write nonfiction, it's going to be under Karen Abbott. But if I turn to fiction, I think I'm going to write under a different name. So that's why I started to carve that path out for myself. So
before the interview,
but the lesson: don't Google yourself.
Sorry. And before the interview started, we talked a little bit, and you said you are working on a piece of fiction.
Yeah, it's and like I can't really separate myself from my love of history and my love of fact. So it's based on a woman I read about for the Smithsonian a couple years ago, a Gilded Age con artist in New York City who sort of lies her way into New York society, and then her past starts catching up with her, and there's not enough there for a nonfiction account. So it's the first time I have to put the flesh on the bones, and I can't tell yet if it's liberating or paralyzing. I'm still at the very beginning of it, so I'm hoping it's going to be the former.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
To Karen Abbott. the author of a new book, well, September book called Liar, Temptress, Soldier, Spy. Boy, I can't get that out. Who is with us because you are here at the Savannah Book Festival. We are in your debt. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you.